Welcome back to Domain 5, the fifth and final domain of the Comptia Security Plus Exam Cram series, which focuses on governance, risk, and compliance, the subjects that form the foundation of real future cybersecurity leaders. As always, we're going to touch on every topic in Domain 5 as detailed in the official exam syllabus, with the intent of helping you drill down more effectively to that right answer on exam day. As always, this is a great first stop to identify your weak spots, a great refresher right before you walk into the exam. I'm glad you're here, lots to cover, so let's get to it. Well, welcome and congratulations. You've reached the fifth and final domain of the Security Plus Exam Cram series, and again today we're focusing on governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC. And although the weighting of this domain is a little lighter than most of the others and the content a bit shorter, I will say it may prove to be particularly challenging. I really view GRC as strategic content. It's content in the focus of security leaders, so it's really exciting in that respect, and I'm excited to get into this with you. Again, there are 6 core lessons in the series, the first being the intro and the 5 that follow being domains 1 through 5, and you've reached the end here. I'll produce some shorter supplemental lessons over time as your questions direct, but I think what we have here in this series is the core that you need to help prepare for exam day as part of the strategy that I lined up at the beginning of this series. Now, as with all the videos in this Exam Cram series, again, I'm focusing on the official exam objectives. Everything we're covering today, line by line, from the official Comptia exam objectives document. And as always, I recommend that Security Plus exam study guide because it includes 1,000 flashcards, 1,000 practice questions to practice exams. So it's really good as that gauge of your knowledge as you go along, and it fits right in with my exam preparation strategy. It supplies the source material. Now, just as importantly, this bundle, which you can get at Amazon for a really good price right now. I have the least expensive link in the video description, but it includes a 10% exam discount coupon, so it pays for more than half of the bundle itself, which is pretty exciting. So let's get into it. And do remember, as with all my videos, a PDF copy of the presentation is available in the video description to help in your review for the big day. So 5.1, compare and contrast various types of controls. And we'll talk about control categories and control types. I will say, know the security controls that fall into each category for the exam. I think even if you don't see a lot of that on the exam itself, it will be very useful for you, and I'm going to provide a fair bit of guidance there to make it easy for you to bring that on board. So let's start with security controls. These are security measures for countering and minimizing loss or unavailability of services or apps due to vulnerabilities. The terms we commonly see are safeguards and countermeasures, which you'll see used interchangeably. But there is a subtle difference, and that is that safeguards are proactive controls and countermeasures reactive controls. The functional order of security controls matters as well. Certainly we're implementing a layered defense, and it begins with trying to deter bad behavior, to deter attacks, and if we're unsuccessful in discouraging somebody from attacking at all, then we want to deny their attempts. If we are unsuccessful in denying their attempts, we want to detect all of their actions in the context of that attack, and we certainly want to delay their progress as much as possible until we can stop their efforts, be that with other security measures or with law enforcement, depending on the situation. And there are 3 categories of security controls that are called out in the exam objectives. There's managerial, which includes policies and procedures defined by the organization's security policies, as well as other regulations and requirements, which may come from the industry or even the government in some cases. And we have operational controls, which are executed by company personnel during their day-to-day operations. This would include things like security awareness training, change management, business continuity planning. And then technical or logical is the final category, which involves the hardware or software mechanisms implemented by the IT team to reduce risk. So that would include things like firewall rules, antivirus and anti-malware, and intrusion detection and prevention systems, just to name a few. So let's talk security control types. So these would include deterrent controls, which are deployed to discourage violation of security policies. We then have preventative controls, which are deployed to stop unwanted or unauthorized activity from occurring. So you may notice a pattern here. These layers we're talking about follow the functional order of security controls that I mentioned a moment ago. We then have detective controls, which are deployed to discover or detect unwanted or unauthorized activity. And then compensating controls, which provide options to other existing controls to aid in enforcement of policies. Compensating controls give us another layer in the event one control is ineffective or maybe one control is unavailable in a particular situation. But just focus in on those key words there for the exam, and that will help you get down to the right control type. And continuing on the types, we have corrective, which modifies the environment to return systems to normal after an unwanted or unauthorized activity has occurred. Then physical controls, I think, can best be described as controls you can physically touch, like a fence, for example. And here, just to call out those keywords to help for your exam prep. And now let's look at a few examples of these control types. So in the preventative category, where we're stopping behavior, we have controls like fences, locks, man traps, alarm systems, job rotation. The deterrent category, which is discouraging behavior, we also see locks, fences, security badges, security guards. So I want you to notice that in my examples here, that you'll see some controls show up in multiple categories, and that's because a control can serve multiple purposes. So for example, a nice tall fence can discourage violation of security policies until it doesn't anymore. When that attacker decides, I'm going to go ahead with that attack, then the fence becomes a preventative control that is in place to stop that activity. Just like a camera, a closed circuit television system can be a deterrent control until that attacker moves into that attack, at which point it becomes a detective control. So a control can fit into multiple categories. The detective control would include items like security guards, guard dogs, motion detectors, intrusion detection systems, etc. Physical controls, remember, preventing direct contact with systems or portions of a facility. That's where we're really getting into those physical items that you can touch. Then we have the corrective category, which is deployed to restore systems to normal. So a few examples here include intrusion prevention, antivirus, business continuity planning, just to name a few, and then compensating controls, which play that supporting role to other existing controls. Security policies, personnel supervision, monitoring, and work task procedures. All right, moving on to 5.2. Explain the importance of applicable regulations, standards, or frameworks that impact organizational security posture. So we're going to dig into regulations, frameworks, and benchmarks that are called out in the exam objectives, as you can see here. So I do want to just take a moment to define sensitive data, as it's going to come up in regulations right away. So sensitive data could be described as any information that isn't public or unclassified. Two categories that you're going to see quite commonly in security discussions are personally identifiable information, or PII, which is any information that can identify an individual. Name, social security number, birth date, biometric records. And then protected health information, or PHI. This is health-related information that can be related to a specific person to help us identify a specific person. Now, we will dig into data classifications a bit later in this video, but I wanted to call these out now because they'll have relevance when we're talking about regulations which focus on privacy, really. So let's start with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. So this deals with the handling of data while maintaining privacy and rights of an individual. This is an international regulation because it was created by the European Union, which has 27 different countries as members. And GDPR applies to any company with customers in the EU. So the key words there are any company and customers in the EU. So if you are a US-based organization and you have customers who live in the European Union, GDPR rules and regulations apply to your organization. And although we'll touch on some of these controls later, I want to just call out a couple of steps you can take to reduce or eliminate GDPR exposure. So the first is anonymization. This is the process of removing all relevant data so it's impossible to identify the original subject or person. If this is done effectively, then GDPR is no longer relevant for the anonymized data because it can't be tied back to the individual person. This is good only if you don't actually need the data. And then we have pseudo-anonymization, which is the process of using pseudonyms or aliases to represent other data. This can result in less stringent requirements than would otherwise apply under GDPR, and you'd use this if you need the data and you want to reduce your exposure. So let's talk national, territory, and state laws. So this is a fairly vague exam objective. I'm going to call out some common examples and give you some keywords to help you remember these easily in the event they come up on the exam. So we have the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, which is focused on the services of banks, lenders, and insurance. So it's really focused on those industries, and it limited the services they could provide and the information they could share with each other. So really focused on privacy in that respect. Then there's the Federal Information Security Management Act, which required formal information security operations for federal government to include the activities of their contractors in their security management programs. This replaced a couple of older regulations, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology is responsible for developing the FISMA implementation guidelines. But this is government focused, and that's really about all you need to remember at most for exam day. Any mention is going to be brief, and just remember it applies to government. Other laws that factor is HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That's the one I'd expect you'd most likely see on the exam if something comes up related to privacy, because that applies to protected health information, the PHI. HITECH is Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health. That really widens the scope of privacy protections under HIPAA. I didn't see that mentioned in the official exam objectives. Always remembering that the exam objectives are not exhaustive, meaning they can slip something in. I really expect if you see something, it would be HIPAA mentioned. So just remember those acronyms, and remember it ties back to healthcare. Graham-Leach-Bliley, again, is financial institutions. We have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, which was designed to protect children under age 13. And then there's the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or ECPA, which prohibits a third party from intercepting or disclosing communications without authorization. Again, I wanted to call out the most prominent U.S. laws that come to mind as it relates to privacy, and then of course GDPR, which I see multiple times in the exam objectives. I'm not sure how much you're going to see here, but you have some key words to help you remember these in the event they pop up on the exam. And there's one more that may come up, and it is mentioned repeatedly, so I expect you'll see this one, and that's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. Now, this was a widely accepted set of policies and procedures intended to optimize the security of credit, debit, and cash card transactions. Now, what's unique about this one versus everything I've mentioned to this point is this is not a law. This was developed jointly in 2004 by 4 major credit card companies, namely Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and American Express. It's based on 6 major objectives. So a secure network that has to be maintained in which transactions will be conducted, and that cardholder information must be protected wherever it's stored. Systems should be protected against the activities of malicious hackers. Cardholder data should be protected physically as well as electronically. Remember, there is no security without physical security. Networks must be constantly monitored and regularly tested, and a formal information security policy must be defined, maintained, and followed. So if this is not a law, how is it implemented? Well, generally speaking, this is included in contracts, so it is implemented, it is enforced contractually between those credit card companies and the businesses that use their services. So let's talk key frameworks. And we'll start with the Center for Internet Security, which is a not-for-profit organization that publishes information on cybersecurity best practices and threats. They have tools to help harden your environment and provide risk management. They do provide benchmarks for different operating systems, and they provide controls to help secure your organization. Now, for these frameworks, I'm going to give you hyperlinks where you can go read a little more if you're interested. I do think these will factor in your security life, so they're good to know, and good to know where to find the details. We then have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, abbreviated NIST. And NIST has the Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF, which is a set of guidelines and best practices to help organizations build and improve their cybersecurity posture. Now, although historically NIST has focused on government organizations, CSF is aimed at private industry, commercial businesses. And this replaces NIST's Risk Management Framework, or RMF, which was designed to focus on risk management for governmental agencies. Now, you'll find information on the CSF and RMF at these 2 websites. And you'll commonly see the Center for Internet Security referenced to CIS and the National Institute of Standards and Technology represented by their acronym, which is NIST. Next up, we have the International Organization for Standardization, who develop global technical, industrial, and commercial standards, several of which are called out on the exam objective. So we'll just run through a few of their standards that were mentioned specifically. We have ISO 27001, which is Security Techniques for Information Security Management Systems. This is an international standard on how to manage information security. There's the URL if you'd like to read more. We have ISO 27002, the Code of Practice for Information Security Controls, which aims to improve the management of information. Then we have 27701, which is an extension to the first 2, and it focuses on Privacy Information Management System, or PIMS. And then ISO 31000, which provides principles, a framework, and a process for managing risk for organizations of any size in any sector, meaning commercial or government. And you'll find more information at ISO.org at the URL you see there. And you'll see the International Organization for Standardization referenced simply as ISO, as you see called out in their frameworks. And rounding out the frameworks mentioned, we have Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements. So SSAE 18 is an audit standard to enhance the quality and usefulness of system and organization control, or SOC, reports. It's really designed for larger organizations like cloud providers. The cost of a Type 2 report can run $30,000 or more, so this is not a framework that's going to be used by smaller companies, generally speaking. SOC 2 Type 1 is a report that assesses the design of security processes at a specific point in time. And then there is a SOC 2 Type 2 report, which also assesses those controls, but over time by observing operations for 6 months. Commonly referenced as SSAE, and last but not least, we have the Cloud Security Alliance, which is a not-for-profit organization that produces resources to help cloud service providers like online training, webinars, discussion groups. They hold some virtual summits on occasion. And they produce the Cloud Control Matrix, which is designed to provide a guide on security principles for cloud vendors and potential cloud customers to assess the overall risk of a cloud provider. They also produce the CSA reference architecture, which contains best practices for CSPs and examples, and it examines topics like security and risk, presentation services, application services, information services, and then various aspects of operations. For the exam, I want you to remember that the CSA CCM helps potential customers measure the overall risk of a cloud service provider. And the Cloud Security Alliance gets the nickname commonly the CSA. So let's talk benchmarks, which are configuration baselines and best practices for securely configuring a system. And there are several called out on the exam objectives, the first being platform and vendor-specific guides. So these are released by vendors with new products so they can be set up as securely as possible, making them less vulnerable to attack. So anytime Microsoft, for example, releases a new operating system or a software product, they will release a benchmark. They will release configuration guidance. Cisco, as they release new network solutions, hardware devices, they'll do the same thing. And your other vendors will, generally speaking, follow that pattern. Web servers. There are two main web servers used in the commercial space, and those are the Microsoft Internet Information Server, or IIS, and the Linux-based Apache. Because they're public-facing, these are going to be prime targets for hackers, so to help reduce risk, both Microsoft and Apache provide security guides to help teams reduce the attack surface, making them more secure. And they'll include guidance like making sure security updates are in place, that unneeded services are disabled, and the operating system is hardened to minimize the risk of security breach. So continuing down the benchmark list, we have operating system benchmarks, and Microsoft and your Linux-based operating systems all have guides that detail the best practices for installing and configuring their operating system securely. You will also find that OS benchmarks are available from CIS and other organizations. Application servers. So when your vendors release applications, they'll produce guides on how to configure the application securely, like email servers or database servers, just making them less vulnerable to attack. Network infrastructure devices. Again, Cisco will produce benchmarks for secure configuration of any device that they release. But benchmarks really aim to ease the process of securing a component, reducing the attack footprint, and minimizing the risk of security breach. And incidentally, your periodic vulnerability scans will help you identify any vulnerabilities that pop up, in part perhaps because you failed to implement some element of secure configuration from one of these benchmarks. Moving on to 5.3, we're going to focus on policies for a bit. Explain the importance of policies to organizational security. We'll touch on a wide range of personnel policies, third-party risk management, and then policies related to data, credentials, and the organization itself. So I want to talk about two security principles that are very important, and that's need to know and the principle of least privilege. These are two principles implemented that help limit access to data and systems so that users and other subjects only have access to what they require. They only have access to the resources and information they need to know, and they only have the privileges that they require to perform their duties. These help prevent security incidents, and when incidents do occur, they help limit the scope of these incidents. When these principles are not followed, security incidents will result in far greater damage to an organization on the whole. While you won't see fraud, collusion, espionage, or sabotage called out explicitly in the exam objectives, many of these personnel policies are designed to prevent exactly those acts, so I'm going to call them out here in context to help you remember these policies more effectively and their purpose on exam day. So collusion is an agreement among multiple persons to perform some unauthorized or illegal actions. And a separation of duties policy can help here. It's a basic principle that ensures no single person can control all the elements of a critical function or system. It would take two to complete a specific function. And then there's job rotation, where employees are rotated into different jobs or tasks are assigned to different employees. Now, implementing these policies also helps prevent fraud, which can be executed by a single person, by limiting the actions individuals can do without colluding with others. So, monitoring privileged operations. So, privileged entities are trusted, but they can abuse their privileges. It's important to monitor all assignment of privileges and the use of privileged operations. The goal here is just to ensure that trusted employees do not abuse the special privileges they are granted. It may not be malicious, it may be casual, but monitoring these operations can detect many attacks because attackers commonly use special privileges, and that could be an external attacker that has compromised those credentials, or it could be that internal resource who is at that point a malicious insider. And before we run through the rest of the personnel policies list, I want to take a detour and talk about espionage and sabotage and the difference between the two. So espionage begins from outside the organization. This is when a competitor tries to steal information, although they may use an internal employee to execute their plan. That would certainly be a malicious insider. Sabotage is an act from within the organization where malicious insiders perform sabotage. They damage the company, perhaps damaging systems, deleting or stealing information when they become disgruntled for some reason often. So talking through personnel policies, we have the clean desk policy, which increases the physical security of data by requiring the employee to limit what is on their desk to what they are working on at the present time. Anything else is secured and out of sight. We have the non-disclosure agreement, which is a legal contract intended to cover confidentiality. The scope of an NDA will vary based on the situation. You always want to review the terms before signing any NDA to ensure that the scope of the NDA is appropriate. But confidentiality is the key aim. Background check. So all potential employees should be thoroughly screened with an extensive background check before being hired and granted network access. And that background check should be part of an employment screening policy, really. Acceptable use policy. This describes how employees in an organization can use company systems and resources, including software, hardware, and access. It should include the consequences of misuse. There's job rotation, which is not allowing one person to be in one position for a long period of time because extended control of assets can result in fraud. Mandatory vacation, so requiring employees, especially those in sensitive areas, to take their time off because a temporary replacement provides another measure of oversight and can potentially uncover unwanted activity from that person they are temporarily replacing. Separation of duties. This is a basic principle that ensures no single person can control all the systems of a critical function or system. We mentioned this earlier. It reduces the likelihood of collusion amongst employees. We have least privilege, where a subject is only given those privileges necessary to complete their job, and this can prevent or limit the scope of security incidents and data theft. Social media analysis. So analyzing the social media of a potential employee during the hiring process to understand more about that individual based on their internet presence can help identify cultural alignment and character concerns. This can also be useful for existing employees in identifying employees that may have become disgruntled. Hopefully this isn't necessary, but monitoring for negative sentiment on social media may uncover employees that are going negative on the company and can give you an indicator that they are a potential future malicious insider. I hate to talk about monitoring employees within the organization, but it's a fact of life. So onboarding policies, this is the process of integrating a new employee into a company and its culture, introducing them to customers, etc. This often includes review and signing of company policies like an acceptable use policy. And then there's offboarding, which is the process that leads to the formal separation between an employee and the company, whether that be through resignation, termination, or retirement. This includes a return of equipment, access badge, and often an exit interview to learn more about why that employee is leaving the organization. And disabling user access in this process should be aligned between IT and HR, so access is disabled in a timely fashion. Next up is gamification. This is used in computer-based training to provide employees with a question or challenge periodically through the training process. It can help to gauge learner retention of the information that's being presented. Sometimes in gamification, you'll also see promotion to competition by awarding points and providing a leaderboard so learners can understand where they rank compared to others in terms of their progress or their performance. Then capture the flag. This is a security-related exercise or competition where someone is trying to hack into a resource to gain access to data, typically multiple someones. And you'll have different varieties of capture the flag, but the red team is offense, the team who is attempting to breach, while the blue team is defense, attempting to defend resources. Benefits here could include skills development, so making folks better at their job, more skilled, but it's also a great team building exercise. It can improve employment morale. We can give an award to the winners at the end. Phishing simulations. These are false phishing emails sent to employees by IT, typically using a service that measures response in terms of pass or fail. And oftentimes the fail will trigger just-in-time user training. So when the user clicks on that phishing link, instead they're taken to a website that turns this fail into an immediate training opportunity. This is very common today. It's pervasive, and it definitely measurably helps organizations do better with response to phishing, because we find users become less susceptible over time through a combination of phishing simulations and user awareness training. Now, in gamification, I mentioned computer-based training briefly, which is self-paced training available via computer, whether for job role or skills enhancement. It may be an always available service. Some organizations will subscribe to an external service that provides an always available on-demand computer-based training system where they can also measure use. I've used that multiple times myself, and will look month to month to see what overall employee engagement is in that system. Then there's role-based training, when a company carries out related training specific to a user's job role. This should include training on role-specific security awareness as well to improve the organization's security posture from an operational perspective. Moving on to third-party risk management, we have the Business Partnership Agreement, or BPA, which is an agreement between two companies who want to participate in a business venture to make a profit. A BPA will generally detail each partner's contributions, their rights and responsibilities, as well as details of operations, decision-making, and sharing of profits. It will also include rules for the partnership ending, either at a given point in time or if one of the partners dies or moves on personally or professionally. We then have a Memorandum of Understanding, or an MOU, which is a formal agreement between two or more parties indicating their intention to work together toward a common goal. It's similar to an SLA in that it defines the responsibilities of each party. It's really a more formal alternative to a handshake, but it lacks the binding power of a contract, which leads us to a Memorandum of Agreement, which is similar to an MOU but serves as a legal document and describes the terms and details of the agreement. Then we have Measurement Systems Analysis, or MSA, which provides a way for an organization to evaluate the quality of the process used in their measurement system. It will assess the measurement process itself and then calculate any uncertainty or variation in the measurement process. So MSA is an important element of Six Sigma methodology and of other quality management systems. It evaluates the test method the instruments, and the process to ensure the integrity of data used for analysis. And we have the non-disclosure agreement. So in the context of third party, it's a contract with our vendors and suppliers not to disclose the company's confidential information. You'll often see a mutual NDA which binds both parties in the agreement. And there's end of life, which is a point at which a vendor stops selling a product and may limit replacement parts and support. End of life is often specific to a specific version of software or hardware. Then we have end of service life, which is the point at which a product is no longer sold by the manufacturer, updates cease, and support agreements are not renewed. It's really considered the final phase of product life, but products are usually declared end of life before they are declared end of service life. So let's talk supply chain. So today, most services are delivered through a chain of multiple entities. A secure supply chain includes vendors who are secure, reliable, trustworthy, and reputable. We have to exercise due diligence in assessing vendor security posture, business practices, and their reliability. This may include periodic attestation requiring vendors to confirm continued implementation of security practices. I will say in the real world it's quite common that from certain companies like Microsoft will receive an annual survey that requires us to attest to our implementation of continued security practices. A vulnerable vendor in the supply chain puts the organization at risk. We always have to be mindful of that. This is an ongoing process. Supply chain evaluation. So when we're evaluating third parties in the supply chain, we need to consider on-site assessment. So visiting an organization, interviewing personnel, and observing their operational habits. This doesn't always happen, but it's an option we'll often want to make available to us through our contract. Document exchange and review. So investigating data set and doc exchange, review processes. Process and policy review, so just requesting copies of their security policies, processes, or procedures to confirm that they have these standards written down and that their employees are aware. And then third-party audit. So this is where we might have an independent auditor provide an unbiased review of an entity's security infrastructure. That's a little more extreme, and it definitely will come with a cost if we bring in an independent auditor, but it's one of those elements that you'd like to make available as an option by implementing it in your contracts with your vendors. Service level agreements. So with our vendors, SLAs stipulate performance expectations, such as maximum downtimes, and it often includes penalties if the vendor doesn't meet expectations. An SLA is generally used with external vendors. Agreements like this between internal departments or business units within a company will be called operating level agreements. So it's a different element, and I don't think you'll see operating level agreements on the exam, but I wanted to just call out the difference to help cement service level agreement in your mind. Moving on to credential policies. We have personnel policies for internal staff. So the identity provider will be under the management of IT, which means we have greater control. So we want to avoid using shared accounts unless necessary, because when we have multiple employees using a single account, this breaks non-repudiation, which is our ability to definitively prove that a specific act was carried out by a specific person. I do find today it is very uncommon we will see employees using shared accounts. They are generally speaking alternatives that will allow us to maintain our audit trail and non-repudiation. We want to implement best practices for multi-factor authentication, password complexity, and we want to ensure that least privilege is enforced. So for third parties, so think business partners, vendors, and suppliers, we may include accounts from external identity providers, and this is very common with Azure Active Directory, which is the identity provider for Office 365. We'll see this commonly with OAuth 2 and OpenID. So it should be required to use multi-factor authentication. Whenever possible, we want to make sure that our third-party identities that are accessing our resources are MFA'd before they get access to our sensitive resources. And additional conditions should be applied for sensitive operations. And what that means is that conditions would include location, device, and connection method. We want to make sure that this user is coming from an expected location, perhaps on a device that we trust, as we would see in the case of offshore development, and that their connection method is as expected. Devices. Default passwords on any devices we receive should be changed before they are put into production. This is going to be very common for your small office, home office, wireless access points, or IoT devices, little smart assistants. And for MDM managed devices, that's mobile device management platforms like Microsoft Intune, certificate authentication may be possible. And we want to ensure that access is restricted for unknown, unmanaged, or non-compliant devices whenever possible. That's where network access control can come into play, which we've talked about previously in this series. But desktops, laptops, mobile devices, point-of-sale devices, and IoT all fall into this device category. Then we have service accounts, which are used to run applications or services such as antivirus. And this may run as a local service account, which is very common today. It will run as a generic service identity with the same rights as a user. Occasionally, we will see that a system account is necessary, providing higher level of privilege, giving a service full control. And whenever possible, we want to make sure that our services are running with only local privilege, basically least privilege for a service account. You never want to give a service an account, an identity that has access across your network unless absolutely necessary, because that opens the door to lateral movement in your environment if that account is compromised. Then we have administrator or root accounts. So administrator accounts on Windows and root accounts on Linux should be protected as they enable elevated access. They should require periodic password changes, and we should enforce password complexity. Admin users should have 2 accounts. We should make sure that our admin users have a normal account for day-to-day operations and an admin account for administrative duties. Some of your cloud providers will even offer an option where your users can have 1 account and they can elevate their account to privilege when they need that privileged access, and then it is revoked automatically after a period of time. But worst case, we should have admins having 2 accounts, that normal account and that privileged account, for implementing least privilege and minimizing our exposure. And all accounts should have some form of multi-factor authentication enabled, bearing in mind that SMS as a second factor is strongly discouraged. It's the weakest form of multi-factor at this point in time. And related to credential policies, I wanted to just bring up a concept we talked about back in Domain 3 in Section 3.7, and that's conditional access, where we apply conditions of access to an authentication attempt. And we can do this with our employees, but also potentially with our third parties, where we look at signals like their location, the device, the application they are using to access our resources. In the case of employees, many identity providers will give us a way to measure real-time risk and to make decisions based on that risk level. And if we don't see any problems in the signal, we can have a policy that then perhaps requires MFA or simply allows access if it's trusted user, trusted device, trusted location, blocking access if we see problems, and if all the gates are passed, then allowing access to apps and data. This is often possible in federation scenarios for identity platforms that support conditional access, where if we even have third parties coming in using SAML or OAuth or OpenID in federation scenarios, we can apply conditional access. So let's talk organizational policies. I want to touch on configuration change and asset management, which can prevent security-related incidents and outages for sure. So configuration management ensures that systems are configured in a similar fashion, that configurations are known and they are documented. Baselining ensures that systems are deployed with a common baseline or starting point, and imaging is a common baselining method. Change management is the policy outlining the procedures for processing change. This helps reduce the risk associated with changes, including outages or weakened security from unauthorized changes. So it requires changes to be requested, approved, tested, and documented. And then we have change control, which refers to the process of evaluating a change request within an organization and deciding if it should go ahead. Requests are sent to the Change Advisory Board, or the CAB, we call it, to ensure that it's a beneficial change for the company. So just to summarize, change management is the policy that details how changes will be processed in an organization, and change control is the process of evaluating a change request to decide if it should be implemented. Change management is guidance on the process. Change control is the process in action. Then we have asset management, which is the process where each asset belonging to the company has been tagged and recorded in an asset register. If we maintain an asset register that's up to date, it's going to ease the process of tracking and maintaining assets, and this usually includes periodic, generally annual audits to ensure that all of our assets are accounted for. This can help the security team identify unauthorized devices on your network. There's certainly a financial element to asset management, but there's also a security component. And asset classification should align with our data classifications to ensure that we're only accessing sensitive data from secure assets. So rounding out 5.3, we're going to talk about data policies, which ensure data is being appropriately classified, handled, stored, and disposed of. So classification is the process of labeling data with relevant classifications indicating the level of sensitivity. We might see top secret, secret, confidential, or sensitive, but the classification determines how data is handled. We're going to dig into classification later in section 5.5. So governance is the oversight and management that describes security controls applied at each stage of the data handling process from creation to destruction. It details the process used to manage, store, and dispose of data to ensure that the organization meets their compliance obligation. And retention ensures that we don't hold data any longer than we need to, as unnecessary retention increases liability and risk. But there are regulations that mandate retention. An org may have to retain data after its usefulness for regulatory compliance. An example, one regulation requires hospitals retain protected health information for at least 5 years. And moving on to 5.4, summarize risk management processes and concepts. So we'll talk about risk types, risk management strategies, risk analysis, disasters, and business impact analysis. And I have to just reiterate, the whole of Domain 5 really discusses topics that are going to factor in leadership certifications like the CISSP exam, and all of these topics especially so. So you're going to get a good leg up on some of those exams that you'll approach later in your career. So let's start with risk types, and there are 6 types of risks you should know for the Security Plus exam, and it starts with external risks, which would include different threat actors ranging from competitors and script kiddies to criminal syndicates and nation states. And their capabilities really depend on tools, experience, and funding, and those criminal syndicates and state actors being at the high end of skills, tools, and funding. Other external environmental threats would include natural disasters like fire and floods, or man-made threats such as the accidental deletion of data or users. Internal, a malicious insider, a threat actor who may be a dissatisfied employee, like someone overlooked for a promotion. Another internal threat is human error, which is when data is accidentally deleted. Legacy systems. Risks may include end of support and security patches because legacy system vendors may deem that a system has reached the end of its service life, the last stage of life. And as technologies improve, so do the hacking tools, and the legacy systems may have limited or no protection against them. Vulnerabilities to legacy systems tend to increase over time. Multi-party risk comes along when a contractor wins a contract and then subcontracts some of the work to another company who may in turn subcontract again. And if any of these companies involved in the chain go out of business, it can cause disruption to the company. And any party in the agreement with security issues could also put the company at risk. This is going to be a common scenario in supply chain, and these risks should also be addressed in your business impact analysis, which we'll touch on in 5.5. So intellectual property or IP theft. If thieves steal your copyrighted material, your trade secrets, and your patents, it may result in loss of revenue. And the data could even be used by those attackers in other countries where a legal route to recover your data or seek damages is impossible. This is an area where data loss prevention solutions or document management systems can help. DLP in particular can protect documents even if they're exfiltrated. So if an attacker manages to exfiltrate the data, they won't be able to access it. So software compliance and licensing. So software purchased from a disreputable source, often done to save money, may not include valid licenses. It could lead to a fine, and it may even contain malware. We would typically call this a licensing violation because you don't have a valid license. You may also have a situation where employees use more copies of the company purchased software than the licenses that you purchase, sometimes for personal use. This would be called a compliance violation. There are several risk management strategies called out in the exam objectives, and you should be familiar with all of them. So responses to risk can include accepting risk, which is where we do nothing. We just accept the risk and the potential loss if the threat occurs. There is risk mitigation, which is where we implement a countermeasure, and then we accept the risk that remains, which is the residual risk. This is really the act of reducing risk. Risk transference, where we transfer or assign risk to a third party, like by purchasing insurance against damage. That's what cyber insurance would do. Risk transference is sometimes referred to as risk assignment. And then there's risk avoidance, where the costs of mitigating or accepting the risk are higher than the benefits of the service itself. So we simply avoid the risk by not implementing the service. Risk appetite, which is sometimes called risk tolerance, is the amount of risk a company is willing to accept. And these terms, risk appetite and risk tolerance, are generally used interchangeably, though there are experts who can articulate a difference. I really think you'll see only risk appetite on the exam, but if risk tolerance comes up, it should be functionally equivalent for purposes of Security Plus. Now, there are also regulations that affect our risk posture. They address data privacy and security and influence our risk posture. These would include GDPR, Sarbanes-Oxley, which is SOX, the HIPAA or Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and then Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard or PCI DSS. On this exam, I expect if you see anything, you're going to see GDPR, HIPAA, and PCI DSS. There are several exam objectives in the risk analysis category, beginning with the risk register, which is a tool in risk management and project management. It's sometimes used to fulfill regulatory compliance, but it's just as often used to track potential issues that can derail intended outcomes. And a risk register typically includes several details. It's going to vary, but it will often include the risk ID, a description, a probability, an impact, a severity, our response to that risk, and who owns that risk, who owns the response. And metrics in a risk register, like I say, will vary from company to company and based on their use. How we use those in risk management and project management will vary slightly. It should be considered a living document, and it's updated periodically, at least annually. And then there's a risk matrix or a heat map. So a risk matrix is used to provide a visual representation of risks that are affecting our company, and the heat map shows the severity of the situation, with the least severe risks in green and the most severe being in red. We have the likelihood of risk and then the impact of that risk, or the damage that it may do, the level of damage it may do. Then there's the risk control assessment, which occurs when a company periodically checks that the risk controls they have in place are still effective with changing technology, and this may involve an external auditor or expert. But more frequently, we'll see companies implement a risk control self-assessment, which is conducted by employees within the company, often through a survey or department-level review, where employees evaluate risk control so management-level decision makers can decide if current controls are still adequate. It's a bottom-up approach often used in smaller organizations, but just as often used ahead of an external audit to ensure the organization is ready for that audit of their risk controls. And risk awareness is the process of educating employees to increase their risk awareness and to encourage them to identify, review, and report concerns. This can bring new insights into reducing risks from those most familiar with the risks to which the company is exposed. So I want to talk about residual risk, inherent risk, and total risk to ensure you are very familiar with the difference between the three for this exam and for your career, because it definitely matters when we talk about risk analysis. So residual risk is the risk that remains even with all the conceivable safeguards in place. This is the risk management has chosen to accept rather than mitigate. Then we have inherent risk. So these are newly identified risks not yet addressed with risk management strategies. When we adopt a new service, we identify risks that are inherent, that are baked into the adoption of that service. So in other words, inherent risk is the amount of risk that exists in the absence of security controls. Then we have total risk, which is the amount of risk an organization would face if no safeguards were implemented. So just to recap here, residual risk is our risk after we've applied safeguards. Inherent risk are the risks present before we have applied safeguards, and the total risk is risk without any safeguards. On the exam, I expect you'll see residual risk and you'll see inherent risk. So control risk is the likelihood that cyber incidents will exploit vulnerabilities within an organization's IT environment. Now, moving on to risk analysis. There are two ways to evaluate risk to assets. There's qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. So quantitative risk analysis assigns a dollar value to evaluate the effectiveness of countermeasures. It's objective. It uses formulas. Quite often, to prioritize, you'll see an initial calculation using an impact times probability score. And then we have qualitative, which uses a scoring system to rank threats and effectiveness of countermeasures. This scoring system is very subjective. It will typically use low, medium, high, or a number scale. It's also generally less accurate than quantitative risk analysis. So I'm going to touch now on risk analysis terms that are called out in the exam objectives. And these terms have formulas that go along with them. But what I found in the exam objectives was incomplete coverage of risk analysis, which is not surprising because Security Plus is more of an entry-level security certification. So I'm going to fill in some gaps for you, and what you'll find is the terms that are not called out in the exam objectives are colored in red, so you know that you don't need to remember these for the exam, but I feel it's important for you to understand them because it's going to give context to everything else. So in risk analysis, we have what we call the exposure factor. This is a decimal, a percentage value of an asset that's lost due to an incident. For example, if we expect that a tornado is going to cost us 50% of the value of a building, that would be our exposure factor. There's the single loss expectancy, or SLE. This is how much would it cost the organization if it happened just one time. So the SLE is expressed as a formula as the value of the asset times the exposure factor. And let me be crystal clear, I do not expect you need to remember these formulas for the exam, but it's context. I want you to understand these terms, not just memorize them, so you can see here why for single loss expectancy I had to tell you about exposure factor. Then there is the annualized rate of occurrence. This is how many times does a particular event happen in 1 year. And you'll want to watch when you're out in the field for annualized rate of occurrences that are longer than 1 year. I'll circle back to that in just a moment. But the annualized rate of occurrence is how many times does it happen in 1 year. But I want to talk to you in a minute about occurrences that will happen less than once per year and how that's expressed. And then we have the annualized loss expectancy. So how much will you lose per year due to a specific risk? So the annualized loss expectancy is our single loss expectancy times our annualized rate of occurrence. And again, if these formulas are a little much, it's simply for context. The annualized loss expectancy is how much will we lose per year. So let's circle back to the annualized rate of occurrence. So this is how many times does it happen in a year. So we want to watch for AROs that are longer than 1 year. Those are represented as a fraction. For example, one occurrence every 5 years would be 0.2. One occurrence every 2 years would be 0.5. For the exam, annualized rate of occurrence is the likelihood of occurrence. But again, I don't expect to see in-depth quantitative risk analysis in front of you on the exam. Focus on the terms. Don't worry so much about the formulas. I put these here to provide you some context. And a couple of supporting terms and concepts just to wrap up risk analysis for the exam. Asset values called out in the objectives. Asset value is the monetary value of the asset for which we're making calculations. Now, not mentioned is safeguard evaluation. This answers the question, is the safeguard cost effective? Because generally speaking, organizations will not spend more than an asset's value to protect the asset. So typically we're not going to spend $5,000 to protect a $1,000 asset. So this next section is entirely extra credit. It'll only take a moment, but it's going to give you some context to really help you understand these risk analysis terms. So the 6 major steps in quantitative risk analysis. Number 1 is inventorying the assets and assigning an asset value. Second, identifying threats. We research each asset and we produce a list of all the possible threats of each asset, and we calculate the exposure factor and the single loss expectancy. So you see I'm tying these steps back to those terms to which they're related. Step 3, we perform a threat analysis to calculate the likelihood of each threat being realized within a single year. That's the annualized rate of occurrence, aka the likelihood of occurrence. And remember, likelihood of occurrence is how you'll see that phrased on the Security Plus exam. Then we estimate the potential loss by calculating the annualized loss expectancy. Then we're going to research countermeasures for each threat and then calculate the changes to the annualized rate of occurrence and annualized loss expectancy based on the applied countermeasure. In other words, when we apply countermeasures, we expect that the threat will occur less frequency, so the annualized rate of occurrence will decrease, and thus our annualized loss expectancy will also decrease. And then finally, we perform a cost-benefit analysis of each countermeasure for each threat for each asset. So I hope this helps tie all of this risk analysis content together for you. Feel free to reach out anytime as you're preparing for the exam. These are pretty heavy concepts in Domain 5, so I just wanted to give you some context to help you understand this better for exam day. So moving on to disasters. You want to know the common types of natural disasters that may threaten an organization, which could include earthquakes, floods, storms, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. It's an event that occurs in nature. And then you want to know the common types of person-made disasters, what we may have in the past heard phrased as man-made disasters. So we now say person-made disasters that may threaten an organization. This could include explosions, electrical fires, terrorist acts, power outages, or utility failures. Internal versus external. So how does disaster location factor in impact to the organization, and how does that influence our disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning? Well, if an office is impacted, workers may be able to work from home. The impact of an unavailable office, though, will vary by the type of business. If we're providing a service to customers that doesn't require them to visit our office, then working from home is just fine. On the other hand, if we operate a hair salon or a massage therapy center, we often have clients come to see us, so then it will matter. If it's a manufacturing facility, it may impact the organization's ability to produce products altogether, but the risks will vary by site and the impacts will vary by the site's purpose. Now we're going to move into some terms under the business impact analysis category of the exam objective. So there is functional recovery plans, which focus on the steps required to restore critical business processes. Plans use structured walkthroughs, tabletop exercises, and simulations to help gauge their efficacy. Then there's the single point of failure. So any non-redundant part of a system that, if unavailable, would cause the entire system to fail is a single point of failure. This is going to be very undesirable in any system that requires high availability and reliability, such as supply chains, networks, and applications. And two items that are generally spoken of together are the recovery point objective, or RPO, which is the age of the data that must be recovered from backup storage for normal operations to resume if a system or a network goes down. And the related recovery time objective, which is the duration of time and a service level within which a business process must be restored after a disaster in order to avoid unacceptable consequences associated with that break in continuity. You will find that SLAs between a company and its customers will influence their RPO and RTO targets. Breaking an SLA is going to be an unacceptable consequence, generally speaking. And just to touch on a couple of business continuity planning related definitions for the exam, we have the business impact analysis, which is the process of assessing the impact of disasters to the business, including lost sales, recovery costs, really getting that all-in figure. BIA looks at financial loss following a disaster. The business continuity plan is the overall organizational plan for how to continue business, and the disaster recovery plan is the plan for recovering from an IT disaster and having IT infrastructure back in operation. And we have touched on these previously in this series. I wanted to touch on them here again. But know that the BCP is business focused and DRP is more technology focused and generally considered to be under that business continuity planning umbrella. Some additional terms related to business impact analysis called out on the objectives include mission essential functions, which are part of the business impact assessment where we determine what the company's mission essential or business critical functions actually are. And then identification of critical systems. So this is the process of identifying the systems that are required to support mission essential functions of the organization. So BIA findings including these areas will influence our business continuity plan and our disaster recovery plan. But before we write up the BCP and the DRP, we definitely want to understand which functions are mission essential and which systems are required to support those functions. Then we have the site risk assessment, which assesses the security risk of a specific location of a site that's planned for use or maybe even in use to meet a business purpose. This will assess a variety of risks from exposure to natural and person-made disasters and other events that may impact business operations or human safety. Do remember that human safety is our #1 objective in security. Some important BCP-related definitions I wanted to call out. Mean time between failures, which is a time determination for how long a piece of IT infrastructure will continue to work before it fails. And mean time to repair, which is a time determination for how long it will take to get a piece of hardware or software repaired and back online. So to recap business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, the goals here are to minimize the effects of a disaster by improving responsiveness, of our employees in different situations, easing confusion by providing written procedures and participation in drills, and helping our employees make logical decisions during a crisis. An auditor assessing business impact analysis will likely focus primarily on single points of failure, as well as RPO and RTO in assessing how effective the organization's plans are. So 5.5, the big finish, explain privacy and sensitive data concepts in relation to security. So we'll talk through the organizational consequences of privacy and data breaches and the notifications that go along with those. We'll talk through data types, so we'll get into data classification. We'll talk about some privacy-enhancing technologies. We'll talk about roles and responsibilities, all related to data. So we're very much focused on data in 5.5, and we'll touch on the information lifecycle and some related documentation around information and privacy. So let's start with the consequences of privacy and data breaches. The first being reputational damage. When we have a security breach, it can certainly result in a loss of customer trust and ultimately a loss of revenue. And the effects may last for years if the situation is not handled correctly. Identity theft, which involves someone using a person's private information to impersonate that individual, usually for financial gain. And if that breach results in data exfiltration, we're potentially exposing many people to identity theft if we're losing customer data. And if a business experiences intellectual property theft as a consequence of a data breach, they can lose customers, credit ratings, brand reputation, and they can even forfeit first-to-market advantage, loss of profitability, and they might even lose an entire line of business to competitors or counterfeiters. Fines. So failing to report a breach can result in fines that can reach into the millions of dollars. In fact, GDPR outlines fines of up to 4% of a company's annual global revenues, or 20 million euros for failing to report a breach. And it may lead to lawsuits. But remember, any company with a customer in the EU is subject to GDPR. And let's talk notifications of breaches. So if a data breach occurs, failing to report that breach, as I just mentioned, can result in fines into the millions of dollars. The EU sets their standard in GDPR, and notification of data breaches must be reported within 72 hours. Now, escalations to external sources like law enforcement or outside experts to stop or investigate a breach may well be necessary. Other countries have their own reporting timescale, and delays may sometimes be allowed for criminal investigation. But we're talking about laws, so when in doubt, we get the legal department involved. Now, there are a number of data types called out in the exam objectives. I'm going to lay these out in a way that I hope makes it as easy as possible for you to commit all these to mind. So we'll start with what I call the core four here, and we're going to look at data classifications in a government context and a non-government, think public or commercial business context. So at class 0, we have unclassified data, or what we'd call public data in the commercial space, which means loss incurs no damage. We then have confidential data, or what we'd call sensitive data in the commercial space, where the organization would experience damage. Next, we have secret data, we'd call it on the government side, or private data in the commercial space, which would cause the organization serious damage. And then at the highest level, we have top secret, or what we'd call confidential or proprietary data in the commercial space. But in either case, this is data that would cause exceptionally grave damage to the organization, potentially threatening their ability to move forward successfully. But you'll notice here some parallels between how the government classifies data and how we classify data in the commercial space in non-government organizations. So touching on sensitive data, again, sensitive data is any information that isn't public or unclassified. So two common types of sensitive data that are certainly going to come up on the exam would be personally identifiable information, which is any information that can identify an individual. So that would include name, social security number, birth date, birthplace, biometric records, etc. And then protected health information, which is health information that can be related to a specific person and is covered under the law by HIPAA. Now, I'd mentioned these two briefly earlier in the session. I wanted to bring them up here again in the context of data classification so they're top of mind, because they're definitely going to be on the exam. So let's talk through a few other sensitive data types and expand on others a bit further. So there is critical data, which is data a company does not want to disclose. It could also be classified and encrypted to prevent someone from reading it. We then have proprietary data, the data that was at the top of the pyramid we just looked at. That would include trade secrets or work done by the research and development department, data that would cause the company grave damage if exposed. Financial information, data about a company's bank account, share capital, any investments they've made, credit card and payroll data. Customer data, data held about individual customers of an organization should never be divulged. And we also need to protect information about the account manager that works with a customer. That could also be classified as customer data. Because if a threat actor were targeting a customer and they could find out who their account manager was, they could potentially try to work another angle there to compromise that customer through that account manager. Then there is government data, data collected by governmental agencies, and there are strict rules for how that data can be shared, normally only internally. And the government often have strict rules contractors have to follow when the contract is finished and the data used in the contract is to be disposed of. In other words, they can't simply just delete the data and move on. There are several data roles and their related responsibilities you're expected to know for the exam. They're called out on the objectives. I want to start with the two roles I think are the most likely to show up on the exam, and then we'll cover the others. So the first is data owner. This is usually a member of senior management. They can delegate some day-to-day duties. They cannot delegate total responsibility because that owner is ultimately responsible. There is the data custodian, which is usually someone in the IT department. They do not decide what controls are needed, but they do implement the controls for the data owner. Just a tip here, if the question mentions day-to-day, it's going to be custodian, and if it mentions decisions, it's going to be data owner. So here are your key characteristics to commit these to memory. Now there are some other roles that are listed on the exam objectives. What I thought was interesting about these is you see these data roles come up in GDPR terminology. So there's the data processor, who is a natural or legal person, authority, agency, or body, which processes personal data solely on behalf of the data controller. The data controller is the person or entity that controls processing of the data. And then there is the data protection officer, who under GDPR is a mandatory appointment within an organization. And it's the responsibility of the DPO to ensure the organization complies with data regulations. But those are the 5 roles, data roles you'll want to be familiar with for the exam. So let's talk privacy-enhancing techniques. So we'll start with tokenization. This is where meaningful data is replaced with a token that is generated randomly, and the original data is held in a vault. So tokenization is interesting because it's stateless, it's stronger than encryption, and the keys are not held locally. Another technique is pseudo-anonymization. This is a de-identification procedure in which the personally identifiable information fields within a data record are replaced by artificial identifiers or pseudonyms. Now we can conceivably retrieve the original identity information by reversing this process through access to another data source. And then we have anonymization. This is the process of removing all relevant data so that it is impossible to identify the original subject or person. This is only effective if you do not need the identity data for some other purpose. Data minimization is really the practice of collecting only the data that's necessary to fulfill the stated purpose. Collect the minimum amount to meet the stated purpose and manage retention to meet regulations. And then we have data masking, which is when only partial data is left in a data field. Only partial data is visible. This is very common with PII data like a social security number or financial data like a credit card number. If you've ever made a purchase online, you've likely seen your credit card number masked in this way. And this can be implemented at the database tier or in the front-end application. Where it's implemented doesn't matter so much as the end technique that you see here. So let's talk through the information lifecycle. And I want to start with what we touched on in Domain 4, which was the functional lifecycle. But I want to talk about what we need for the exam. So I want to take some of that terminology and change it over to something a bit more aligned with what I've seen in Security Plus study material. But what you need for exam day is generally simpler than that functional 6-phase process that we talked through. So we talked about classification, storage, use, retention, which is important, right? We were talking about data retention and that we need to retain data to be compliant with laws or regulation, and that we need to dispose of data in a way that it is not readable. So whether we call that phase disposal or destruction, we need to destroy that data at end of life so it is not recoverable. And what you need to know for the Security Plus exam depends on who you talk to, frankly. So one study guide presents a 4-phase information lifecycle: creation, use, retention, and disposal. And you know from what we talked about in Domain 4 that we need to classify data after creation so it's protected appropriately. And we need to encrypt that data both at rest and in transit, so when it's in use, it is appropriately encrypted. But one source will show you this life cycle. Another study guide showed this life cycle. This particular information life cycle comes straight from the Storage Networking Industry Association article on Wikipedia. And I'm not saying that study guide took the information from Wikipedia, but they were definitely showing the Storage Networking Industry Association model. And if you go to another source yet, the official Security Plus study guide, that bundle I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is the diagram from the official study guide. That is to say, there is no diagram. There's a brief bit of text about the information lifecycle. So they were not showing a visual representation at all. So I believe this information and the functional tour of the information lifecycle I took you through in Domain 4 should leave you well prepared for exam day. So rounding out 5.5, we have the impact assessment, which is where one assesses the potential impact to data security and privacy. An impact assessment can help security identify appropriate security controls, and an assessment should be conducted for new services, projects, and initiatives. But it really enables proactive identification and remediation of issues before they become a production problem. They really help the company avoid data breach, is the bottom line. Terms of agreement comes up on the exam objectives. This may be called terms of service or terms of conditions. I'd say these other alternatives are both more common than terms of agreement. It tells the customer what will be legally required of them if they subscribe to your service or download and use your mobile app. The user must agree to the terms to use the service. It is not required by law, but it reduces risk to the company. Now juxtapose that to the privacy notice, which may also be called a privacy policy. This documents handling of personal data, and it answers questions like what data is collected and for what purpose, and with whom will the data be shared. This is required by law in many regions and countries. Now to get down to the bottom line, terms of agreement protects the company. The privacy notice protects the customer, the user. And congratulations, you have reached the end of Domain 5 and the end of the Security Plus Exam Cram series. I hope you're feeling prepared for exam day. As you make those final preparations, feel free to reach out with questions in the comments or directly on LinkedIn. Best of luck on the exam, and until next time, take care and stay safe.